In order to identify some of the issues and how to overcome them with African American poverty and all of his self-hatred, we do have to talk about a controversial topic, which he says is Black sexuality in Chapter 7. So sexuality in general is always a taboo subject. People are fascinated by it, but they're also disgusted and scared, and they want to just brush it under the rug, even though it's just a part of everyday life for people. So why is Black sexuality a topic worth exploring in Race Matters? Because it has a lot to do with America's psyche, with our kind of bipolar psyche when it comes to being simultaneously fascinated and exotifying African American individuals, but also objectifying them and using crude terms to describe this type of sexuality, or just sexuality in general amongst people of color. And so he says that Americans are fearful of sex, but they're also excited about it. And he says throughout the past, centuries, there have been a lot of stereotypes and sexual myths about African American individuals. So this idea that terrible stereotypes about African American men having the sexual prowess, or African American women having sexual prowess. And so he says that it differs for the genders, but there are a lot of these weird taboos and myths associated with Black sexuality, so we have to talk about it. And he says that there's this history of African American individuals being viewed as distorted, dehumanized individuals, or African American women not even being viewed as the way white women were viewed, and not being viewed as kind of delicate and needing to be taken care of, but they were viewed as these kind of mythical monsters in a way during the times of slavery. And that's why you have feminist thinkers like Bell Hooks talk about how feminism has been really exclusive for white women and has not really talked about issues that women of color experience, because some of the issues that white feminists have complained about were things that African American women were not experiencing, since they were not viewed as women the way white women were viewed as women. So of course we have to think about the differences here when it comes to various genders and how time has really impacted our perception of sexuality. He discusses how the 1960s was a really interesting time when it relates to sexuality in general, but specifically with demythologizing Black sexuality in a way. It's not as if the stereotypes and the myths and all those things still exist today, but he says that you have more interracial dating and interracial sex that's introduced into society, so it does help with putting people into contact with one another and decreasing at least some of the terrible myths that are out there. And what's interesting, though, is you have kind of a backlash in the late 1970s and 80s, and you have more of a kind of a conservative reaction to sex, sexuality, and interracial marriage and dating. And in order to think then about the impact of these different time periods within our society today, we see how there's more of an access to Black sexuality that white Americans experience, or that people of color in general experience, when you think about media portrayals, music, athletes. So there is more of an exposure to African Americans and African American sexuality, as Cornel West talks about, but it's still in a weird stereotypical way where someone might say something like, oh, well, a hypothetical white person might say, oh, I've never dated a Black person, and so I'm going to do that, right? That's really not an appropriate way of thinking about cultivating relationships with other people, or saying that, oh yeah, I'm curious what X racial group is in bed, right? Those are examples of how people can perpetuate these dehumanizing myths and stereotypes. And what is the impact of this upon African American men and African American women for Cornel West? Well, he says that Black male sexuality is viewed as this kind of special, fascinating way of existing, because it's ironically, a way that Black men have been viewed as having power in a white supremacist society, but at the same time, it's a weird kind of quarantined form of power. So it's not actual power. And that's the weird irony that exists. And so he talks about the obsession with athletes, and we can also think about the obsession with rappers. But then when it comes to issues of social justice within the African American community, people kind of turn a blind eye to it. And he also contrasts Black male sexuality with this idea of sexual prowess and how African American men are viewed as ideal sexual partners compared to Black female sexuality. And he says that African American women are experiencing patriarchy and the degradation of female sexuality on top of the degradation of being African American in this country. And so he kind of introduces this idea from Malcolm X, who said that African American women are the most disrespected group of people in this country. And I think we can still see how that is with respect to the stereotypical portrayal of African American women, how they're talked about, how they're viewed as exotic, the obsession that we have in this country for a specific type of hair or specific type of facial features or bodily features. And we see if an African American woman has certain features, then she's ridiculed or she's viewed as unprofessional or hypersexual. But if a white woman perhaps appropriates some of these features, just thinking about the Kardashians, for example, then they're viewed as sexy and hot. So those are just some of the things that African American women have to deal with in our society. And there is an interesting video I have on our page about how if you Google beautiful woman, for the first 3 pages, it's just white women. And then if you Google unprofessional hairstyle, then you see African American women. So I think those are some examples of the stereotypes and the myths and the racism and the white supremacy that Cornel West is talking about. So if we're thinking then about overcoming white supremacy, poverty, self-hatred, nihilism, etc., then we have to think about all aspects of life, economic aspects of life, the public sphere, but also the seemingly private sphere of sexuality. And a way to overcome all of this terrible socialization that we've all experienced and that's internalized amongst communities of color who can then hate themselves or hate their features or hate their hair, for example, is how self-love is really important. And he says, I don't mean love in terms of kumbaya, but I mean a love ethic in terms of forgiving oneself and also caring about oneself and forming multiracial alliances and solidarity in order to overcome a lot of this collective clinical depression that he's talking about. So self-love is important. Being able to care about oneself and other people. He refers to the metaphor of jazz in the epilogue and how it's a way specifically for him as an African American, discussing the African American community. He says it's a way to have an identity that can be fluid and that can change, but you still have agency with it, because jazz you can't really capture. It's something that is up to the beat and the melody. So that's kind of how he concludes Race Matters.